LGB. 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 LGB.
They say LGB everywhere I go. LGB. What it means, I don't know. LGB. Whatever it is. LGB. Kamala, help me, please. Please.
Alrighty then.
Thank you. LGB.
That's let's go, Brandon, right?
LGB.
This means let's go, Brandon.
No. LGB.
Sounds like let's go, Brandon, I guess.
LGB. All right. Let's go, Brandon.
I am Cornholio.
Chant LGB. Right wing and left wing. LGB. Go, you know the thing. LGB. If you don't sing that back. LGB. And you ain't black. LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
FJB. Let's go, Brandon.
I'm Joe Biden, and I forgot this message.
Greetings, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm your host, Patrick Gunnels, joining you from Houston, Texas, this February 19th, 2024 at 7:54 a.m. Central Standard Time. I've got one piece for you today, and that comes from Joe Lange. That's right. From badlands.substack.com, Joe Lange's latest piece, The Battle for Control. Please don't forget, this show is brought to you by Angel Paste. Go to www.epicthreads.tv to look for Angel Paste and other products that are on the way. Use promo code Shapiro to pry $1 from my grasping hands. And if you get 3 or more bottles, bam, you get free shipping. Angel Paste is the best lotion the world has ever known, made of only food-grade plant oils, invented by my sister Barbara, manufactured by her at her home in Spring, Texas. This is the best thing your skin has ever touched. Go to epicthreads.tv. Use promo code Shapiro. Your skin will drink it up. Without further ado, from badlands.substack.com, The Battle for Control. Whoever controls the money controls the government. By Joe Lange. My last 2 articles focused on what I believe is Trump's plan to transform the banking system in the United States and give control back to the people. By placing the power of the banking system back into the hands of the people, Trump will also prevent our government from being controlled by private bankers, whether foreign or domestic. Safeguards are the key to our future, and many will be put in place to maintain control. Power is going back to the people. I focused on the banking system for a reason. In previous articles, I also focused on the CIA and the history of George H.W. Bush that revealed how he was behind the creation of a CIA-controlled shadow government that controlled the president and the entire executive branch. This CIA shadow government started wars, installed dictators, assassinated people, trafficked drugs worldwide, and laundered untold billions through many corrupt banks. Banks are the key. Why? Q told us to follow the money. The money trail is what reveals the truth. The money is what proves our history is a lie, and just how corrupt this entire global system is. Money has been the key to power and control. It is a system controlled by a small group of elites who have placed money above all else, including human life. The corrupt money that the cabal loves can be traced through the crooked banks who are in bed with them. The banks are just another layer of puppets, and so is the CIA. The CIA has laundered money through many banks, and I have mentioned some in my previous articles. Which one is the worst? Which bank is the most complicit money laundering tool for the CIA? It is a bank that has been at the center of so much corruption that I can't include all of it in this article. It is a focal point for revealing many things. I started this series focused on Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Al Saud, and how Trump took him off the chessboard. He was the biggest threat to Trump the day he was inaugurated, and I will prove that in the coming articles. There is one bank at the center of both the CIA shadow government and Prince al-Walid's power and control. This one bank can lead us down the path to discovering the level of corruption within our government and who was controlling it. It might be one of the keys that opens all doors. I've mentioned this bank in recent articles, and I also tied it directly to drug trafficking and money laundering operations. It was at the center of the Medellin cartel money laundering and also the Salinas family drug trafficking in Mexico. Both operations were directly tied to the CIA and George H.W. Bush. None of this is a coincidence. Which bank is it? Citibank. I believe Citibank might be the most corrupt bank in the world and has been for a long time. It has been exposed throughout its history as corrupt, and yet it has been shielded by politicians who are also controlled by the same elites and shadow government. But do you know the history of Citibank? Do you know how far back it goes in American history and what big events that it was behind? I think it may surprise a lot of people. I want to use this article to go back into the history of Citibank so that we can fully understand the power behind the corrupt banks and how they have shaped our history. My next article will connect Citibank directly to Prince al-Walid so we can understand how he became so powerful and such a great threat to Trump. The history of Citibank. Citibank has been around a long time. It was established in 1812. And has grown into a behemoth with tentacles stretching around the world. According to Wikipedia, Citibank was founded in 1812 as the City Bank of New York and later became First National City Bank of New York. The bank has 2,649 branches in 19 countries, including 723 branches in the United States and 1,494 branches in Mexico, operated by its subsidiary Banamex. The U.S. branches are concentrated in 6 metropolitan areas: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Miami. It is important to understand how big a reach that Citibank has had worldwide. I think most people in this community probably understand that Citibank is corrupt, but I don't think a lot of people know just how big a role that this bank has played in our history. It has over 2,600 branches located in 19 different countries. Its U.S. branches are concentrated in just 6 major cities. But most importantly, it owns a Mexican subsidiary bank called Banamex, which has almost 1,500 locations in Mexico. That's not a coincidence. It was through Banamex that Citibank was using currency exchange facilities in order to launder drug money for the Medellin cartel and the CIA. I wrote about that in my article titled Follow the Money. But how long has Citibank been a controlled puppet for a cabal of elites? It was the first chartered bank of New York, and it was established in 1812. It was a private bank funded by a small group of wealthy merchants who would dominate the financial and political system in the state of New York. It was chartered just 2 days before the start of the War of 1812. That wasn't a coincidence. The War of 1812 was a war between the United States and Great Britain. Why were we in a war with Great Britain in 1812? There's an easy answer, and it involves one thing. Control. Control of what? Our money. We may have won the Revolutionary War for independence, but we soon turned control right back over to Great Britain when we established the first central bank in America. It was called the First Bank of the United States. The very first central bank was created when Alexander Hamilton convinced President George Washington and Congress to charter a national bank. Why did Hamilton want a national bank? According to ushistory.org, the war left us in debt. Some states were bankrupt. We needed one unified currency. Hamilton suggested a central bank. Quote, the first bank of the United States was needed because the government had a debt from the Revolutionary War, and each state had a different form of currency. It was built while Philadelphia was still the nation's capital. Alexander Hamilton conceived of the bank to handle the colossal war debt and to create a standard form of currency. Up to the time of the bank's charter, coins and bills issued by state banks served as the currency of the young country. The first bank's charter was drafted in 1791 by the Congress and signed by George Washington. End quote. Central banks are always forced on countries because of one thing: debt. The economy was struggling with high inflation because the new government was in a lot of debt due to the War for Independence. There was strong opposition to the central bank at the time, led by Thomas Jefferson. He argued that the federal government had no authority under the Constitution to create a national bank that was also a privately owned corporation. But Hamilton argued that it was allowed because the Constitution didn't specifically deny it. This was the very start of the struggle over whether the Constitution limits the federal government's power over the states. It was also the beginning of the corruption of the Constitution. The Constitution was written to limit the power of the federal government, and it defined its powers and responsibilities. I believe a future court case is coming where the Supreme Court will determine whether central banks are constitutional. Jefferson made an argument that I believe will be the winning argument when the Supreme Court determines that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. What was Thomas Jefferson's argument? According to Federal Reserve history, quote, "Not everyone agreed with Hamilton's plan. Thomas Jefferson was afraid that a national bank would create a financial monopoly that might undermine state banks and adopt policies that favored financiers and merchants, who tended to be creditors, over plantation owners and family farmers, who tended to be debtors. Such an institution clashed with Jefferson's vision of the United States as a chiefly agrarian society, not one based on banking, commerce, and industry." Jefferson also argued that the Constitution did not grant the government the authority to establish corporations, including a national bank. Despite the opposing voices, Hamilton's bill cleared both the House and the Senate after much debate. President Washington signed the bill into law in February 1791. End quote. Was Jefferson right? The Federal Reserve is now the third central bank in the history of this country. Has the Federal Reserve become a financial monopoly? Does it undermine local banks and favor Wall Street bankers and corporations? Has the Federal Reserve catered to the creditors over the debtors? The answer to all three questions is yes. These are some of the reasons why I believe the Federal Reserve will be declared unconstitutional in the future. Power back to the people. Thomas Jefferson clearly saw the difference between the two classes of people and feared the federal government choosing the side of the elite over the majority of the people. The federal government was supposed to serve and protect the people, not hand the power of the country's money over to private bankers. Money is power and control. The Rothschilds have lived by that mantra for generations, and they have been the family establishing and controlling central banks all over the world. That's how they have controlled governments and their people. They've also started wars to protect those central banks. The War of 1812 was one of those wars. The first Bank of the United States was established in 1791, but it was only chartered for 20 years. When the charter expired in 1811, there was a fight in Congress over whether or not to renew the charter. It was a drawn-out battle for a year, and in a close vote, the Jefferson side won, and the bank's charter was not renewed. The first central bank in America was dissolved. What was one of the biggest reasons for letting the charter expire? According to the History Channel, quote, "The bank, based in Philadelphia with branches in 8 cities, conducted general commercial business as well as acting for the government. It was both well managed and profitable, but it won the enmity of entrepreneurs and state banks who argued that its fiscal caution was constraining economic development. Others were troubled by the fact that 2/3 of the bank stock was held by British interests. These critics, working with agrarian opponents of the bank, succeeded in preventing renewal of the charter at 1811, and the first bank went out of operation." End quote. Did you catch that? It was a private bank, not a public bank, and 2/3 of the first Bank of the United States stock was held by British interests. The American people no longer had control of their own currency. We may have defeated the British on the battlefield, but we were no longer independent. They controlled our money supply and commerce, which gave them control of most of our government. When the central bank was dissolved, it ended that control. It was no coincidence that we were in a war with Great Britain a year later. There have been several reasons given by historians over the years, but as I've found in my digging into past history, we've never been told the truth. What was the real reason behind the War of 1812? Here's the background. Great Britain was in a war with France after the French Revolution eliminated the elite's control in France. Napoleon was at war with countries who were controlled by private bankers, and he had sold the United States the Louisiana Territory in the early 1800s in order to help fund his military. The British were capturing American ships, sailing to the West Indies, and forcing some of our sailors to serve the British Navy under what's called impressment. We no longer had a central bank that the British controlled, and we were also a trading partner with France, who was at war with Great Britain. This loss of control over our government by the British led to the War of 1812. But how do we know that control of our money was the main reason for the War of 1812? As we look back in history, we can see the same template used by the banking cabal over and over. Why? Because it has always been successful. The Revolutionary War put our nation into debt, and then politicians created the first central bank to centralize the financial system to pay off the debt. When the charter on the first central bank ended, we found ourselves in another war that would put us back into debt. The cabal starts the wars to force nations into debt, then tricks them into forming central banks to service that debt. This turns the citizens into debt slaves. After the first central bank's charter was allowed to expire, guess which private bank stepped up to help fund the War of 1812? You guessed it, Citibank of New York. Citibank was chartered just 2 days before the start of the war. I believe its sole purpose was to take the place of the central bank that no longer existed and give control back to the cabal of bankers. Our government was once again in debt because of war and would look to private bankers for funding. Citibank of New York, Citibank, would provide that funding and would become a federal depository in 1814. According to HistoryNewsNetwork.org, quote, the Citibank of New York was chartered by the State Assembly in 1812 and was made a federal depository in 1814. The chapter explains that in its early years, the bank, quote, mainly served the commercial interests of the merchants who owned it, end quote, end quote. Even as a depository for our government, the main focus of the bank was to make profits for its owners. That is always the focus for private banks. That is why I believe Trump is going to set up a public banking option to force the banking system to serve the people and protect their savings. Guess what happened after the War of 1812 ended? The same thing that happened after the Revolutionary War. The United States was in massive debt, so the government chartered another central bank called the Second Bank of the United States. The banking system was once again centralized and placed in the hands of a small group of private bankers. They enriched themselves so much that this time it turned the American people against them. Andrew Jackson was elected president, vowing to get rid of the central bank, and that's exactly what he did. But he did some other things that most people probably don't realize. President Jackson waged war against the banking cabal, and I believe that is why Trump focused on him in his first term. What did President Andrew Jackson do? According to the economic historian, quote, though import duties provided the overwhelming majority of federal receipts in Washington, land sales were also a key source of public revenue. President Andrew Jackson took credit for paying off the national debt completely in 1835, and the following year, a record $25 million in land sales accounted for about half of all federal receipts. The U.S. Treasury now had a budget surplus with no public debt, end quote. After dissolving the Second Bank of the United States, President Jackson paid off the entire public debt from past wars by using import duties, tariffs, and public land sales. Our government was debt-free and no longer controlled by foreign private bankers. That was an historic moment for our nation, and it led to another historic moment. What was it? According to author-historian Tara Ross, quote, on this day in 1835, A would-be assassin tries to shoot President Andrew Jackson. The assassination attempt stemmed from Jackson's refusal to reauthorize a charter for the Second Bank of the United States. Senator Thomas Benton noted the, quote, extraordinary case of 2 pistols in succession, so well loaded, so coolly handled, and which afterwards fired with such readiness, force, and precision, missing fire, each in its turn, when leveled 8 feet at the president's heart, end quote. Much of the public thought that Jackson's life had been saved by divine intervention, end quote. It was the first attempted assassination of a president in our history. It wouldn't be the last. Because of Jackson, the federal government now had a surplus of revenues. Remember, this was way before a federal income tax. Jackson then did something else that removed even more control of our government from the foreign bankers. What was it? More from the economic historian, quote, the Deposit Act of 1836 ordered the distribution of the federal surplus into various state banks throughout the country. The geographical orientation of these transfers was key. Normally, importers and exporters in New York City required hard money to settle foreign balances, but the Deposit Act transferred precious metals from the coast to the interior of the country. Monetary reserves in New York City deposit banks fell from $7.2 million in September 1836 to $1.5 million in May 1837, end quote. Under President Andrew Jackson, the federal government had a surplus, and he pushed for that surplus to be distributed to state banks throughout the country. This wasn't fiat money. It was gold and silver. The Deposit Act of 1836 removed the concentration of wealth in New York and distributed it to the west and southern states. The wealthy bankers didn't approve of that at all. In New York, where Citibank was located, the deposit reserves dropped by almost $6 million. Then, Jackson did something else to strip away the power from these same New York banks that were controlled by a cabal of elites. What was it? More from the economic historian, quote, the Specie Circular, an executive order issued by President Jackson in 1836, mandating that all public land sales over 320 acres be purchased in specie, similarly diverted precious metals from east to west, end quote. Large portions of land were being purchased out west using money from wealthy New York bankers. President Jackson wrote an executive order, the Specie Circular, that forced land purchases over 320 acres to be paid for in gold and silver only. No more large purchases of government land using fiat money. How big of an effect did this have on the banking elite? More from the economic historian, quote, in 1836, British financiers began expressing alarm over these events in the United States. When the directors of the Bank of England noticed that the central bank's specie reserves had dwindled to just £4 million, they adopted restrictive measures. While the exact reasons for England's shortage of specie are disputed, the directors blamed the high value of American securities purchased in London, end quote. Jackson had forced the British purchasers of government land to give up their gold and silver, and it was draining England's reserves. For decades recently, we have seen land and corporations purchased by foreign investors such as China using fiat currency. How do you prevent foreign countries from owning your assets? You demand gold and silver. I wonder if that safeguard is on the horizon. What better way to limit the purchase of land, farms, corporations, etc. from foreign investors than to demand gold and silver for those purchases? President Andrew Jackson stopped it with an executive order. Is Trump going to do the same thing? I bet he is. Gold and silver are not only honest money, but also a safeguard for sovereignty. After Jackson's Specie Circular executive order, England responded in kind. More from the economic historian. August 1836, the Bank of England began raising its discount rate gradually from 3 to 5%. It stopped discounting commercial paper from the merchant banking houses that were financing Anglo-American trade. In turn, these actors ceased accepting the foreign bills of exchange that American import merchants had used to pay for British manufactured goods. American merchants could now send only specie to Britain, end quote. England was now trying to get its gold back by only accepting precious metals in exchange for its exports to America. It was a trade war over real money and control. This is something that I believe is coming again between those clinging on to the fiat debt system and the BRICS Plus nations aligned with Trump. This fight over gold and silver reserves led to the Panic of 1837. That was the real catalyst for the panic. But what was the trigger? Here's a clue. More from the economic historian. Quote, in May, New York banks suspended specie payments, prompting banks across the nation to do the same. Suspension did not mean that banks closed their doors permanently. In most cases, it meant that banks refused to redeem credit instruments at full face value, end quote. The biggest bank in New York at the time was Citibank, and it, along with other banks, suspended redemption at full face value of their currency and gold and silver, which caused banks across the country to do the same. This created a currency crisis and a bank run. I believe that was the trigger that caused the Panic of 1837. Citibank, along with other New York banks, were over-leveraged and in financial trouble. They didn't have enough gold and silver on hand to cover their liabilities. Citibank was in need of its first bailout. This wouldn't be the last time Citibank would require a bailout either. Guess who stepped in to save Citibank? A very wealthy American who had immigrated from Europe after the Revolutionary War and made large profits in the fur trade to Europe. He was the first multimillionaire in America. Like all elites connected to the cabal, he made out very well during the Panic of 1837. That's not a coincidence. They caused the panics. Then they profit by buying assets at fire sale prices. Who bailed out Citibank? Have you ever heard of John Jacob Astor? He took control of one of the most powerful banks in the United States by providing a bailout. But taking over Citibank wasn't the only way Astor prospered during the Panic of 1837. According to TheRealDeal.com, quote, the Panic of 1837 was one of the worst years ever for property values in New York City. Many New Yorkers lost their homes to foreclosure, and so many others were in default on their mortgage payments that the state passed a bill granting a year's grace period for them to catch up on what they owed. According to economist Milton Friedman, the 5-year financial crisis was comparable in severity to the Great Depression. But while investors throughout the city were losing their proverbial shirts, John Jacob Astor, the founder of the Astor dynasty, was prospering. In the midst of a free fall in property values, Astor snapped up $224,000 in Manhattan real estate, according to, quote, John Jacob Astor, America's first multimillionaire, by Axel Madsen. Later, when interest rates climbed to 7% and property owners could no longer make payments on the mortgages he controlled, Astor promptly foreclosed on scores of them, end quote. The cabal causes the panics. They also cause the recessions and depressions. They are behind all the wars too. It's always been about money and control, and they always prosper as the majority of the people suffer. John Jacob Astor became known as the landlord of New York City. He was scooping up tons of property at rock-bottom prices and then continuously charging higher rent to force people off their property after they had developed the property themselves. He was the first American multimillionaire and became one by using his wealth and control to take advantage of others in hard times. But how did he gain his wealth before he owned most of the real estate in New York City? He got help from a very specific place, the same place that helps the elite become more wealthy today. According to History.com, after the war ended in 1815, Astor successfully lobbied the U.S. Congress for a series of protectionist legislative bills designed to prevent a repeat of his financial losses in the Pacific Northwest. When Congress passed an 1816 bill barring non-U.S. citizens from owning fur businesses in U.S. territory, the same Canadian company that had purchased Fort Astoria was forced to sell all of their holdings below the Great Lakes to Astor. 6 years later, Astor received additional aid from the U.S. government when Congress voted to close all trading posts operated by foreign governments, leaving Astor with a near monopoly on the fur trade. End quote. After the War of 1812 ended, Astor got Congress to help create one of the first monopolies in America. He lost some of his fur trading outposts during the war, and then Congress banned all foreign fur traders along with trading posts from foreign governments. Astor pretty much controlled the fur trade in America after that. Nothing has changed. Congress still passes laws that encourage monopolies that they benefit from in political contributions. Along with the fur trade, Astor also gained wealth other ways. He contributed to an epidemic that still plagues the world today, but it is rarely talked about in his biography. What was it? According to History.com, quote, when business legend John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he was hailed as a titan of trade and praised as a sharp salesman with a taste for philanthropy. But today, one facet of the first multimillionaire's biography might seem to tarnish his shining legacy, his dabbling in smuggled opium. Astor's enormous fortune was made in part by sneaking opium into China against imperial orders. The resulting riches made him one of the world's most powerful merchants and also helped create the world's first widespread opioid epidemic. End quote. Drug trafficking has always been a big moneymaker for the cabal, and it helped make John Jacob Astor America's first multimillionaire and owner of large areas of real estate in New York City. He also controlled Citibank. I focused on John Jacob Astor for a reason. He is very similar to Prince Al-Walid, whom I will dive back into in my next article. Now, let's look at just some of the highlights from Citibank's early history, starting with the Panic of 1837. According to HistoryNewsNetwork.org, quote, the Citibank of New York survived the panic because John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man in the country at the time, deposited substantial funds in the bank and installed Moses Taylor, an importer of Cuban sugar, on the bank's board of directors. Extended sections describe Taylor's role in transforming the bank into a national financial institution with international connections. The commodity that Taylor specialized in was sugar produced in Cuba by enslaved Africans smuggled into the Spanish colony in violation of international bans on the transatlantic slave trade. During this period, Taylor used sugar profits to help the bank survive a series of economic downturns and to purchase mines, railroads, and real estate. All of the companies that Taylor invested in were then required to use Citibank for financial transactions. End quote. Citibank had a monopoly on the sugar trade in America and was using an illegal slave trade in Cuba to increase profits. It used those slave profits to purchase mines, railroads, and real estate. More from HistoryNewsNetwork.org. Quote, during the war, Civil War, Taylor was able to negotiate a federal charter for the bank, which became National City Bank of New York in exchange for loans to finance the war effort. End quote. Citibank was once again financing the federal government in a war. War is very profitable for the elite. More from HistoryNewsNetwork.org. Quote, after the war, Taylor became a member of Tammany Hall, served on a commission that whitewashed the corrupt Tweed ring that controlled New York City politics, and invested with Tweed in a series of business ventures. When Moses Taylor died in 1882, he was heavily invested in the company that would become Con Edison and was one of the wealthiest men of the 19th century. His estate was reportedly worth $70 million, or about $1.6 billion in today's dollars. End quote. Moses Taylor was installed at Citibank by John Jacob Astor, and he became one of the wealthiest men in the 19th century because Citibank was already involved with and protected by the political class. More from HistoryNewsNetwork.org. Quote, other Citibank heroes had similarly tainted careers. The commemoration celebrates Charles and James Stillman, father and son cotton brokers. Stillman Sr. is identified as a, quote, longtime National City Bank client. He made his initial fortune profiteering during the Mexican-American War and expanded it by smuggling contraband cotton out of Brownsville, Texas, and across the Rio Grande River during the Civil War. His business partner and later his son, James, were City Bank directors, and James eventually became bank president. James started out as a cotton broker after the Civil War, shifted into railroad investment, and then partnered with Rockefeller and Standard Oil as a robber baron, promoting monopoly power in the United States. Maintaining his father's interests in Mexico, during the 1870s, James brokered a civil war that overthrew the Mexican government. Stillman also recruited former U.S. Treasury Department officials to work for Citibank, ensuring the bank's increased wealth and political influence. End quote. The Stillman family took control of Citibank after Moses Taylor passed away. They profited illegally during wars, helped overthrow the Mexican government, and also partnered Citibank with the Rockefeller family in order to monopolize many industries and bring in the dawn of the American robber barons. But don't miss that last point. James Stillman recruited former Treasury Department officials to work for Citibank. This would become a template for many years in the history of this bank and would help shield them from prosecution and ensure their future bailouts. But one particular Treasury official that went to work for Citibank will help lead us into my next article. James Stillman would handpick his successor at Citibank from the Treasury Department. This person would play a key role in the corrupt banking system that we live under today. Who is he? According to cityjournal.org, quote, James Stillman took the reins in 1891. Under his leadership, Citi won Standard Oil and the U.S. government as clients and became the first American bank to reach $1 billion in assets. Anticipating the revolving door between Citi and Washington, Stillman recruited his eventual successor, Frank Vanderlip, from the Treasury Department. After secretly accepting Stillman's offer, Vanderlip spent another year there, a patent conflict of interest. He later became one of the architects of America's third central bank, the Federal Reserve System. End quote. Did you know that Citibank was behind the formation of the Federal Reserve? Stillman handpicked Frank Vanderlip as his successor while he was working for the Treasury Department and secretly helping to form our third central bank. We've had a centralized banking system controlled by foreign bankers ever since. This is what Trump is going to bring to an end. Trump is going to end the Federal Reserve and give control of the banking system back to the people. My next article will tie Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Al Saud to Citibank and so much more. And that is the latest from the amazing and brilliant Joe Lange. Thank you, everybody, for watching this. Thanks for being here on this episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm looking forward to Joe Lange's next article. What great stuff this is, guys. Boy, you know, I hate that phrase, I hope you're right, but boy, I hope he's right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Don't forget to go to epicthreads.tv, epicthreads.tv. Check for new products, but always check rose-infused angel paste, the best lotion the world has ever known. If you get 3 or more bottles, you get free shipping. Angel paste, your skin will drink it up, epicthreads.tv. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Let us pray. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you tomorrow.
I will be the greatest president that God ever created.